Now, we've been testing out the Nintendo Switch 2 for almost 2 weeks, and I've had a tremendous amount of fun with it. And even though the Switch game library is fairly limited, and the hardware is, although a nice upgrade from the original Switch, is probably not worth the extra price point. But how does the Switch 2 compare against probably one of the most popular handheld gaming devices probably ever, the Steam Deck? Well, specifically, we have a new Steam Deck OLED that we're going to compare directly against. We're going to take a look at the overall design differences, physical dimensions, as well as the control schemes, game mode, take a look at the displays, internal specs, graphics, game library, and battery life. And then ultimately, we're going to weigh out the pros that each console presents to determine which one is the best overall value and the best handheld. Now, firstly, I want to talk about the price point between these two. The Switch 2 is $450. It comes with the two Joy-Cons, the dock, and the controller adapter. The Steam Deck OLED starts at $550 for the 512GB version. You can also get the standard Steam Deck with the LCD display that retails for around $400 for the 256GB version. Now with the Steam Deck, you don't get a dock with it, so that's about $90 extra if you want HDMI connectivity. Obviously, you can also adapt the USB-C connection on the console to HDMI, but if you want the extra connections, it's always nice to have a dock, which is going to be an added cost, but comes included with the Switch. Now, the physical differences are pretty apparent between these two. You can see that the Steam Deck OLED is definitely a more chunkier beast. It weighs also a lot more at 640 grams versus 534 grams on the Switch 2, and the Switch 2 is certainly the thinner device at only 13.9 millimeters in terms of thickness versus 49 millimeters in terms of thickness on the Steam Deck OLED. So both are certainly not pocket friendly, but if you want the more portable, more sleek, compact device, the Switch 2 definitely has the form factor up on the Steam Deck. On top of that, the Switch 2 is now using magnetically detachable Joy-Cons, which have been revamped, a little bit more ergonomically friendly than the original Switch Joy-Cons, and allows you to game in both tablet mode, handheld mode, as well as in console mode, so you can either use them for two-player or multiplayer applications, as well as just utilizing them in the controller housing, on top of using extra accessories in the dock mode. So there's definitely more ways to game with the Switch 2, and certainly a unique factor to the design compared to the Steam Deck OLED, which is obviously a handheld gaming system, but you can dock it and use a keyboard and mouse or any kind of extra controllers, but obviously the built-in controllers themselves live on the device at all times. Now come back to the Joy-Cons, they have built-in accelerometers and gyroscopes, so you can use them for motion controllers, on top of having the new optical sensor, so you can actually lay it flat on a desktop surface and basically utilize one of the Joy-Cons or both of the Joy-Cons as a mouse. Now as a mouse, the Joy-Cons are even worse in terms of ergonomics, so I actually 3D printed a housing that improved that, and you can even play Cyberpunk in mouse mode, so you can use one of the Joy-Cons as your aimer and pointer like a traditional mouse, and use the other Joy-Cons for your movement, or even hook up a keyboard so you can have a true keyboard and mouse experience on the Switch. Now certainly this is not the first handheld to have this feature, initially found on the Legion Go, but it's cool to see that we have this on the Nintendo side. Now on the Steam Deck, although you have similar control schemes for your dual thumbsticks, the A, B, X, Y buttons, and your menu buttons, but you also have a couple of unique buttons, including the dual touchpads, which actually do a great job of emulating a mouse and cursor movement with haptic feedback, and you can actually play first-person shooters, strategy games, or games really designed for a keyboard and mouse, and actually works really great on this small handheld system. On the back, you'll also find 4 customization buttons, which are not utilized on the Switch 2. It pretty much has no customization buttons on the back besides whatever is on the Joy-Cons. Now, as far as the durability factor, I know that both the previous generation Switch and the Steam Deck have struggled quite a bit in terms of long-term durability, especially if you're going to be using these things on a frequent basis. Things like thumbstick drifts are both apparent on the Steam Deck and the Switch. The new Switch 2 doesn't really feel all that different from a switch gear standpoint. The thumbsticks feel pretty much the same. The button feel and clickiness is very similar to the original Switch. So I think the overall switch gear and the components themselves are very similar in terms of the original Switch. So if you are kind of harsh with your control inputs and use the handheld quite frequently, you will probably have some long-term durability issues with the Switch 2. The controls and buttons on the Steam Deck initially feel a little bit more chunkier and heftier, and the thumbstick itself definitely has a quicker retraction point due to the fact that it has a stronger spring in it. It feels very much like an Xbox controller ported over to a handheld, which is not a bad thing in my opinion. And if something does go wrong on the Switch, it is a little bit more difficult to repair compared to the Steam Deck. Both are not going to be easy, but generally the repairability factor is a little bit easier to access on the Steam Deck compared to the Switch. Now let's move on and talk about the displays on both. In terms of the display size, the Steam Deck does have a smaller display of 7.4 inches versus 7.9 inches on the Switch 2. It also has a lower resolution of 1280 by 800 versus 1920 by 1080 on the Switch 2. The Switch 2 definitely has also the higher PPI count of 279 versus 204 on the Steam Deck. Now, the greater sharpness and clarity is definitely demonstrated quite well on native Switch 2 games such as Mario Kart World and Cyberpunk 2077, and you can definitely tell that we have a more sharpness, clarity in the textures, and just a general, more sharper experience. Of course, however, with the Steam Deck, we get the OLED version, which definitely has a better dynamics, contrast ratio, infinite black levels. The peak brightness in HDR mode is actually quite similar on both panels, up to 1000 nits peak brightness. But I think the better black levels, color dynamics, saturation, on top of the big factor of being 90 Hz refresh rate. And I know a lot of gamers out there would trade a higher refresh rate to higher resolution any day of the week. And if you're in that camp, the Steam Deck OLED is definitely the better display. From an external video output standpoint, now both can technically output 4K resolution at 60 Hz refresh rate, but since we have more powerful internals on the Switch 2, we can certainly get closer to a 4K gaming experience versus on the Steam Deck. Although you can output to a 4K monitor or TV and play some games with it, it is really optimized for a 1280 by 800 resolution in order to get the best frame rates possible, but you can certainly use it as a desktop experience in that higher resolution if needed, but really optimized for that lower 720p-ish resolution versus the Switch 2. Not only has the internal capabilities for the 1080p on the built-in display, but in dock mode is overclocked quite a bit to get you better performance in Quad HD and 4K gaming with supported gaming titles. Now in terms of audio, both have embedded stereo speakers that don't sound all that great. You're probably going to either use the 3.5mm headphone jack to connect your own headset or connect wirelessly through the Bluetooth 5 connection, which is available on both platforms. In terms of the networking capabilities, both have Wi-Fi 6 inside, as well as the ability to hook up gigabit Ethernet through the appropriate docks. Moreover, let's talk about the internals on both systems. Now, starting with the Steam Deck OLED, it's using the Zen 2 architecture from AMD, which is a quad-core processor with 8 threads, has variable frequencies from 2.4 GHz up to 3.5 GHz in turbo mode. The Steam Deck 2 is utilizing the NVIDIA Tegra T239 octa-core processor, which is clocked at just under 1 GHz in undock mode and 1.1 GHz in dock mode. In terms of RAM, we have 16 GB of DDR5 on the Steam Deck versus 12 GB on the Switch 2. In terms of long-term storage, the Steam Deck ranges from 64 GB up to 1 TB from Valve. You can also user upgrade this storage up to 2 TB, which is definitely going to be the most economical option. The Switch 2 has a 256 GB built-in SSD with the ability to expand using the micro SD card slot. Now, you do need express cards specifically, which are more expensive, but you can go up to 2 TB versus on the Steam Deck, you could just use any old micro SD card and it works pretty flawlessly. Moreover, in terms of GPU, obviously the Steam Deck is using an AMD RDNA architecture that has a total throughput of about 1.6 teraflops at 32-bit floating point precision and a maximum power limit of about 15 watts, regardless whether you're in handheld or in dock mode. The Switch 2, on the other hand, can be clocked higher in dock mode up to 3.09 teraflops and in undock mode up to 1.72 teraflops, so certainly more powerful both in handheld and in dock mode compared to the Steam Deck. Now, based on my experience playing Cyberpunk in performance mode on both the Switch 2 and the Steam Deck, I found that the Switch 2 definitely has the greater render output resolution with better texture details even in performance mode, but I didn't encounter any smoother or higher frame rates that were perceivable to my eyes. And obviously within the built-in display, you're always going to be locked to 60 frames per second, but even when capturing through a third-party capturing system, you are going to notice that both gameplays are very similar in terms of smoothness and things like that. You are going to find greater texture details, character and environmental assets on the Switch 2 version of the game. Of course, you cannot customize your ray tracing or texture details on the Switch 2 version. Like other console versions of Cyberpunk, you can only prioritize either quality or performance, and you don't have any customization options, which is not the case on the Steam Deck. You can lower the resolution, change the frame generation, as well as upscaling capabilities to get you higher frame rates, as well as customize your texture details to pretty much the same extent that you would find on a full-on PC. Now, lastly, I want to talk about battery life. Now, in terms of capacity itself, the Steam Deck OLED has a 6400 milliamp hour battery roughly versus 5200 milliamp hour battery on the Switch 2. According to Valve, you can get anywhere between 3 to 12 hours of gameplay, and Nintendo claims anywhere between 2 to 6.5 hours. Now, in order to test the battery life side by side in the exact same circumstance, we played Cyberpunk 2077 on both consoles in airplane mode, 50% screen brightness. We taped both thumbsticks to the right, so we're just doing constant 360 to keep the game load and demand the same. It's important to note that both of these two gaming systems are fairly new, less than a week old as of filming this video, so the batteries are fairly fresh, and both delivered a runtime of over 2 hours. But the Steam Deck shut down at the 2 hour, 16 minute, and 14 second mark versus 2 hours, 27 minutes, and 50 second mark on the Switch 2. So about 11 seconds more runtime on the Switch 2 compared to the Steam Deck based on this exact same situation. Now, you are going to generally encounter a better battery life on the Switch 2 based on my experience, especially when you're playing not as demanding games. And the Steam Deck can be pretty power hungry, although you can definitely optimize it to get better battery life. But in most case scenarios, you are going to get better battery life on the Switch 2 based on what we have encountered. Now, to sum up everything we've talked about, I want to go through the advantage that each console presents, starting with the Nintendo Switch 2. And first and foremost has to be the fact that you have those new magnetically detaching JoyCons. They're definitely improved in terms of ergonomics, and they have the built-in gyroscopes, accelerometers, so you can use them for motion controllers, as well as that built-in optical sensor, so now you can actually play keyboard and mouse style games. And even though most of these features on the new Joy-Cons kind of feel like a gimmick, but there could be opportunities for developers to really take advantage of these features to bring up a more unique gaming experience later down the road on the Switch 2. Furthermore, even though we don't have an OLED display, the LCD screen is actually pretty good looking, especially in terms of brightness, and it is a higher resolution with the full HD display, which will give you better texture details and a sharper experience compared to the Steam Deck. Moreover, it is a more powerful console. Thanks to the newer hardware, it is going to deliver sharper looking games both in handheld and in dock mode. And specifically in dock mode, you can actually game in 4K. And even though the Switch 2 might not be the best 4K or Quad HD living room gaming console, certainly not going to compete against the PlayStation 5, your PC, or your Xbox, but is definitely more powerful than the Steam Deck. Additionally, if you do care about it being thinner and lighter, it is slightly more portable and will fit in smaller spaces if space is a concern for you, especially if you're on the go. Moreover, you also get slightly better battery life. Based on our specific comparison, we got a couple of more minutes, which might mean something if you really do care about getting the most out of your gaming system, especially when using the battery. Moving forward, let's talk about the advantage that the Steam Deck presents. Firstly, apart from being a gaming console, it is running a full Linux Arch distro. So it's a full operating system. You can use it in desktop mode, hook up a keyboard and mouse controller, and it could pretty much be your only PC if you really want it to be. So more than just a console, it is a laptop slash gaming PC more or less. So it definitely has that versatility factor of you actually doing some web browsing, development, whatever you want to do on a basic Linux PC, you can do on the Steam Deck, versus on the Switch 2, it barely has a web browser, and even to this date, the YouTube app is not supported, although that will probably change. But the Switch 2 is really designed to only be a gaming console, not really a media consumption device or even a web browsing device, versus the Steam Deck is way more versatile. Moreover, I love the OLED display on the Steam Deck. Yes, it does come with a heftier price point, but I think if you want that higher refresh rate of 90 Hertz, which is a huge benefit, on top of having the better saturated colors, better black levels, and a greater dynamic contrast ratio, it actually gives it a quite decent edge up compared to the standard Switch 2, which at this point does not come with an OLED display and is 60 Hertz refresh rate. Now, if you want to save some money and don't care about OLED, the standard Steam Deck is actually $100 cheaper if you buy it new from Valve than the Switch 2. So certainly get pretty much the same capabilities as the OLED version, but at a cheaper price point. And yes, with a little bit lower SSD storage capacity, 256 to start it with, or the 64 gigabyte version, but that stuff is user upgradable. And speaking of upgradable, that's another big benefit of the Steam Deck. The fact that you can upgrade some of the internal components, and repairability is a little bit easier. Plus there's a whole bunch of mods and third-party accessories that you can directly attach to the Steam Deck because it's been out for quite a while, versus that will probably eventually happen with the Switch 2, but because it's a newer device, things are a little bit more limited, and the repairability is not going to be as good as the Steam Deck, which is certainly the case for the current Switch right now. And last but not least, probably the biggest benefit of the Steam Deck has to be the game library. You can pretty much play any PC game that you can think of, whether it's on Windows or Linux. And I say Windows because these days, Linux protocols for actually translating Windows game into either any kind of Linux distro is actually very, very good. You can pretty much play any classic PC game to all the way up to AAA gaming titles to indie games and anything in between. On top of that, it's a great emulation platform. You can use things like RioJinx that will actually emulate Nintendo Switch games. So technically, the Steam Deck is also a Nintendo Switch. So just the versatility and the large gaming capacity and library available to you is way better than anything Nintendo could ever deliver. But besides that, guys, that's really it. If you had to pick between the two, it's kind of an obvious answer. For most people, they're probably going to pick the Steam Deck. It is certainly starting at a cheaper price point if you don't care about the OLED, but the fact that you have the higher refresh rate and the big game library, and plus it's kind of a laptop, really puts it into a much better competitive standpoint. And I think for most people, they'll probably just stick with the original Switch. Certainly the game library on the Switch 2 isn't really all that wide right now because it is a new console, but going forward that might change, and they might implement some of the new control schemes with the mouse implementation, as well as the newer internal hardware upgrades to really make the Switch 2 a compelling gaming system. But for now, it's definitely for early adopters, and for most people looking towards a handheld system, I don't think anything is really better than the Steam Deck from a value and functionality perspective. But really on that, guys, that's really it. Definitely love to know what you guys think. If you haven't checked out our Switch 2 versus original Switch and Nintendo Switch Lite review, definitely check out that three-way comparison. That'll be in the description down below. But if you haven't done so already, please make sure to like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so, and we'll see you real soon in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.